Welcome to the Sleep Detective. Tonight we're exploring Dennis Rader, known as BTK bind, torture, kill. For 30 years, he terrorized Wichita while living as a church leader and Boy Scout troop leader. His own family never suspected. What psychological trait allowed him to maintain this double life for 3 decades? Comment your theory below. Subscribe for weekly criminal psychology deep dives and hit that notification bell. Dennis Lynn Rader was born March 9, 1945, in Pittsburgh, Kansas. The oldest of 4 sons, his childhood appeared unremarkable to outside observers, but psychological analysis reveals early warning signs that would later manifest in criminal behavior. The first psychological red flag emerged in Rader's relationship with animals. As a child, he developed an obsession with torturing and killing cats and dogs. This wasn't typical childhood curiosity. It was methodical, ritualistic behavior. Rader's early psychological development was marked by an intense need for control. Unlike other children who might act out through tantrums, young Dennis found satisfaction in powerlessness. The complete powerlessness of his victims. His academic performance was average, but teachers noted something disturbing. His meticulous attention to detail and ability to follow rules precisely. This wasn't typical conscientiousness. It was obsessive-compulsive tendencies manifesting early. The psychological foundation of compartmentalization began forming in his teenage years. Rader learned to present different versions of himself to different people. At school, the quiet student. At home, the responsible son. In private, something darker. His sexual development became intertwined with violence and control from an early age. Rader later admitted he began having violent sexual fantasies as a teenager. These involved bondage and torture. Detailed, recurring scenarios he would mentally rehearse. The psychological pattern that would define his criminal career emerged during high school. Rader discovered he could maintain multiple psychological identities simultaneously, without any apparent internal conflict. Most people experience cognitive dissonance when actions contradict beliefs. His relationship with authority figures was complex and revealing. Rader was drawn to positions of authority himself, but he also enjoyed subverting authority through secret acts of rebellion. This duality would later manifest in his dual roles. The development of his signature psychological trait began in childhood. The ability to view other people as objects rather than human beings. Rader's parents recalled he seemed to lack empathy, even as a young child. His early masturbatory fantasies became increasingly violent and detailed. Rader would create elaborate scenarios involving capture, bondage, and torture. These weren't random violent thoughts. They were carefully constructed psychological blueprints for future reality. The psychological mechanism of dissociation became his primary coping strategy. When engaging in violent behavior, Rader could mentally separate himself from his actions, viewing them as if watching someone else. This allowed him to commit acts without trauma. His teenage years were marked by increasing social isolation, but not in an obvious way. Rader learned to simulate social connection while maintaining emotional distance. He could participate in activities while feeling completely disconnected from others. The development of his ritualistic behavior patterns began in high school. Rader created elaborate private ceremonies around his violent fantasies, complete with specific objects, locations, and procedures. These rituals provided him with control and power. His psychological relationship with fear was fundamentally different from normal people. While most individuals experience fear as a warning signal, Rader experienced fear as excitement. The fear in victims' eyes didn't trigger empathy. It triggered arousal. The compartmentalization of his personality reached sophisticated levels by his late teens. Rader could switch between his public persona and private psychological world instantly. This wasn't conscious acting. It was fundamental splitting of psychological identity. His military service from 1966 to 1970 provided him with additional psychological tools. The military's emphasis on following orders and systematic procedures appealed to his obsessive-compulsive tendencies. He learned violence could be organized and executed with precision. The psychological impact of his military experience wasn't about combat trauma. Rader served in the Air Force and never saw combat. Instead, it was about validation of his natural inclination toward control and systematic behavior. His return to civilian life in 1970 marked a crucial transition, the beginning of his shift from fantasy to action. Rader had spent years developing his psychological framework for violence. Now he began seeking opportunities to implement fantasies. The psychological trigger for his first murder was a combination of factors: fantasy fulfillment and opportunity. Rader had been stalking potential victims for months, studying their routines and vulnerabilities. The Otero family fit his psychological criteria. His psychological state in the months before the first murder was characterized by escalating excitement and anticipation. Rader described feeling like he was building towards something inevitable. The fantasies were no longer sufficient for psychological satisfaction. The development of his BTK identity represented a psychological evolution, from scattered violent impulses to a coherent criminal persona. This wasn't just a nickname. It was a complete psychological identity with its own motivations and methods. His psychological preparation for murder involved months of mental rehearsal. Rader would visualize every aspect of the crime, from the initial approach to the final moments. This was psychological conditioning, training his mind to execute violence. The psychological mechanism that would allow him to kill entire families was disturbing. His ability to view victims as components in a larger psychological experiment. Rader wasn't driven by hatred. He was driven by the need to test theories. His relationship with his own psychology was remarkably detached and analytical. Rader understood that his thoughts and desires were abnormal, but he felt no obligation to suppress them. He approached his development like studying a specimen. The psychological foundation was complete by 1974. Rader had developed all the mental tools necessary for systematic murder: the ability to compartmentalize, the capacity for viewing humans as objects, the skill to plan complex operations. His psychological state on the morning of January 15, 1974, was calm anticipation. Rader had spent months preparing for this moment. He felt psychologically ready to cross the line from fantasy to reality. The Otero family had no idea. The psychological transformation was complete. Dennis Rader, the church-going family man, was about to become BTK. The compartmentalization that had been developing for years was now perfect. He could commit acts while maintaining his persona. His psychological anticipation of the first murder was almost sexual in nature. Rader described feeling intense excitement and arousal as he prepared to implement his long-rehearsed fantasies. The reward system he had developed was about to be validated. The psychological groundwork was laid. Years of animal torture, violent fantasies, military training, and careful observation had created something terrifying, a framework perfectly designed for systematic murder. Rader was prepared to begin his reign of terror. As he approached the Otero house that January morning, Rader's psychological state was complete: confidence and control. He had spent years preparing for this moment. He felt psychologically invincible. The quiet family man was about to reveal the monster. The psychological foundation was complete. Dennis Rader had successfully created two distinct psychological identities: the public man who followed rules and served his community, and the private predator who lived for total control over victims. The personality formation of Dennis Rader was characterized by the development of organized psychopathy. Unlike disorganized killers who act on impulse, Rader methodically constructed his psychological identity around control. This wasn't a gradual descent into madness. It was careful construction of a predatory personality. His childhood experiences created a psychological framework where power meant more than love or human connection. Rader learned early that complete control over another living being provided satisfaction normal social interactions could never match. This reward system became the foundation of his personality structure. The development of his manipulative abilities began in his family environment. Rader observed how different family members responded to various approaches. He learned to tailor his behavior to achieve specific outcomes. He wasn't naturally charming. He was systematically learning the mechanics of manipulation. His relationship with his mother was particularly significant in shaping his psychological development. Dorothea Rader was a strong-willed woman who demanded obedience and respect. Rader learned to comply with her expectations while secretly resenting her authority. This taught him to hide feelings. The psychological mechanism of splitting became central to his personality formation. Rader developed the ability to maintain completely separate emotional states depending on the situation. This wasn't conscious deception. It was fundamental restructuring of his psychological architecture to accommodate contradictory impulses. His academic performance reflected his psychological priorities. Rader was capable of good grades when the subject interested him, but he showed no intrinsic motivation for learning or self-improvement. Education was simply another system to be navigated and manipulated. The development of his obsessive-compulsive tendencies served his predatory psychology perfectly. Rader's need for order, routine, and control wasn't driven by anxiety like typical OC. It was driven by his desire to maintain perfect psychological compartmentalization. His sexual psychology developed along deeply disturbing lines. From adolescence, Rader's arousal patterns became permanently linked to themes of dominance and control. Normal sexual development involves learning to connect with another person. Rader's development centered on complete subjugation of others. The personality trait that would define his entire criminal career was disturbing. His ability to experience other people's fear and pain as personal pleasure. This wasn't sadism in the traditional sense. It was complete psychological restructuring where normal human responses were replaced. His relationship with authority figures revealed his complex psychological needs. Rader was simultaneously drawn to authority positions and compelled to subvert them. He needed to be seen as respectable while secretly believing rules didn't apply to him. The development of his mask of sanity was perhaps his most sophisticated psychological achievement. Rader learned to present himself as not just normal, but exemplary. This wasn't simple acting. It was creation of a completely functional alternate personality. His military service provided him with a psychological template for organized violence. The military's emphasis on following orders, maintaining discipline, and executing complex operations appealed to his nature, while validating his belief that violence could be systematic and purposeful. The psychological impact of his military experience was the realization that his natural inclinations were acceptable. His natural inclinations toward control and systematic behavior were not only acceptable but admirable in certain contexts. This validation strengthened his belief in superiority. His return to civilian life marked the beginning of his psychological preparation for criminal activity. Rader began systematically studying potential victims, learning their routines, and identifying vulnerabilities. This wasn't random predatory behavior. It was methodical application of psychological insights. The personality formation process was completed through his development of what he called projects. These were elaborate psychological experiments where Rader would select victims based on specific criteria, then implement detailed plans for their capture and torture. His relationship with his own psychology was remarkably detached and analytical. Rader understood that his thoughts and desires were abnormal, but he felt no obligation to change them. Instead, he approached his psychological development like a scientist studying a phenomenon. The development of his grandiose self-perception was crucial to his personality formation. Rader believed that his psychological insights made him superior to ordinary people. He saw himself as a master of human psychology. This grandiosity provided psychological justification for criminal behavior. His ability to maintain long-term relationships while harboring murderous intentions revealed sophisticated compartmentalization. Rader could function as a husband, father, and community member while planning murders. These weren't conflicting identities. They were complementary aspects of his psychological strategy. The personality trait that made him most dangerous was his patience. Unlike impulsive killers who act on immediate urges, Rader could wait months or years. This patience wasn't driven by caution. It was driven by his psychological need for complete control. His psychological relationship with his victims was complex and revealing. Rader didn't hate his victims. He was completely indifferent to them as human beings. They were simply objects to be used in psychological experiments. This objectification was more chilling than hatred. The development of his ritualistic behavior patterns provided him with psychological continuity and purpose. Each murder followed specific procedures and protocols that Rader had developed. These rituals weren't random compulsions. They were carefully designed psychological frameworks for achieving maximum control. His relationship with law enforcement was characterized by a complex mixture of fear and contempt. Rader was genuinely concerned about being caught, but he also believed that his psychological sophistication made him superior to investigators. This attitude would eventually contribute to his downfall. The personality formation process culminated in his development of what psychologists call criminal versatility. Rader could adapt his psychological approach to different situations and victims, while maintaining his core identity as a predator. This adaptability made him particularly dangerous. His psychological state during the early 1970s was characterized by readiness and anticipation. Rader had spent years developing his psychological tools and techniques. He felt prepared to begin implementing his fantasies in reality. The personality formation process was complete. The final aspect of his personality formation was his development of a psychological reward system. A reward system based on the suffering of others. Rader had trained himself to experience intense pleasure from fear, pain, and helplessness. This wasn't natural sadism. It was deliberately cultivated response. His relationship with his own mortality was complex and revealing. Rader wasn't driven by a death wish or suicidal impulses. He was driven by a desire to experience ultimate power over life and death. He wanted to play God. The personality formation culminated in his psychological preparation for his first murder. Rader had developed all the psychological tools necessary for systematic killing: the ability to dehumanize victims, the capacity for detailed planning, the skill to maintain emotional detachment. His psychological state on the eve of his first murder was one of calm confidence. Rader had spent years preparing for this moment. He felt psychologically ready to cross the line from fantasy to reality. The personality formation process was complete. The transformation from Dennis Rader to BTK was not a sudden psychological break. It was the culmination of decades of careful personality development. Every aspect of his psychology had been shaped to serve his predatory purposes. He had successfully created the perfect predator. His psychological anticipation of his first murder was almost ceremonial in nature. Rader viewed this moment as the culmination of his psychological development and the beginning of his true calling. He had spent years becoming the perfect predator. The emergence of Dennis Rader's first dark impulses can be traced to a specific psychological moment in childhood, when he realized that causing pain to others provided him with unique satisfaction. This wasn't a gradual development. It was a sudden psychological discovery that would reshape his worldview. The earliest manifestation of these impulses appeared around age 8, when Rader began systematically torturing small animals. This wasn't typical childhood cruelty. It was methodical, ritualistic behavior that provided him with intense psychological satisfaction. He would capture neighborhood cats and dogs for experimentation. His psychological relationship with these early violent acts was remarkably detached and analytical. Rader approached animal torture like a scientist conducting experiments, carefully observing the effects of different techniques and mentally cataloging which methods produced the most satisfying results. The psychological mechanism that allowed him to enjoy animal suffering was his ability to completely dehumanize victims. Rader didn't see the animals as living beings capable of pain and fear. He saw them as objects to be manipulated and controlled. This detachment would later extend to humans. His first dark impulses were accompanied by intense sexual arousal, creating a permanent psychological link between violence and sexual satisfaction. Rader discovered that witnessing fear and pain in victims produced more intense arousal than any normal sexual experience. This conditioning would define his development. The development of his fantasy life began during these early experiences with animal torture. Rader would spend hours mentally replaying his violent acts, elaborating on the scenarios and imagining variations. These fantasies weren't random violent thoughts. They were carefully constructed psychological blueprints. His psychological state during these early violent episodes was characterized by complete control and power. Rader felt that he was the master of life and death, capable of determining the fate of other living beings. This feeling of omnipotence became psychologically addictive. The ritual aspects of his early violence were particularly revealing. Rader developed specific procedures for capturing, torturing, and killing animals, complete with ceremonial elements and symbolic meanings. These rituals weren't compulsions. They were carefully designed psychological frameworks for maximizing power. His relationship with his own dark impulses was complex and evolving. Initially, Rader felt some conflict between his violent urges and social expectations. However, he quickly learned to compartmentalize these feelings, keeping his violent impulses completely separate from his public persona. The psychological reward system that developed around his early violence was remarkably sophisticated. Rader learned to maximize his satisfaction by prolonging the suffering of victims, carefully controlling the pace of violence to maintain peak psychological arousal. This wasn't traditional sadism. It was systematically cultivated response. His early dark impulses were accompanied by detailed planning and preparation. Rader would spend days or weeks preparing for each violent episode, studying potential victims, gathering materials, and planning every aspect of the encounter. This methodical approach became his defining characteristic. The psychological impact of his first successful animal torture was profound and lasting. Rader discovered that he was capable of acts that would horrify normal people. This realization filled him with a sense of psychological superiority. He began to see himself as fundamentally different. His relationship with fear began to evolve during these early experiences. While normal people experience fear as a warning signal to avoid danger, Rader learned to experience fear differently. Both his own and that of others became a source of excitement and arousal. The development of his hunting instincts began with his early animal torture. Rader learned to identify vulnerable targets, study their behavior patterns, and exploit their weaknesses. These skills would later be applied to human victims with devastating effectiveness. He was learning the psychology of predation. His psychological state during his first acts of violence was characterized by intense concentration and focus. Rader felt completely absorbed in the moment, experiencing a psychological state similar to what athletes describe as flow. This complete engagement made violence psychologically addictive. The fantasy elaboration process that began with animal torture would become central to his psychological development. Rader would spend hours mentally replaying and elaborating on violent acts, creating increasingly detailed and complex scenarios. These fantasies served as psychological rehearsals for future violence. His early dark impulses were accompanied by a growing sense of psychological isolation from other people. Rader realized that his thoughts and desires were fundamentally different from family and friends. Rather than seeking help, he embraced this isolation as evidence of superiority. The psychological mechanism of dissociation that he developed during these early experiences would prove crucial. Rader learned to mentally separate himself from his violent actions, viewing them as if he were watching someone else. This detachment allowed him to commit acts without guilt. His relationship with authority figures began to change as his dark impulses developed. Rader realized that his violent thoughts and actions were forbidden by society, but rather than feeling guilty, he felt excited by the transgression. Breaking rules became psychologically rewarding. The development of his deception skills began with his need to hide violent activities from others. Rader learned to present a completely normal facade while internally harboring dark thoughts. This ability to deceive others would later enable him to maintain his double life for decades. His early dark impulses were accompanied by a growing sense of psychological invincibility. Rader felt that he was capable of anything, that normal rules and limitations didn't apply to him. This grandiose self-perception would later contribute to his willingness to commit serious crimes. The psychological conditioning that occurred during his early violent experiences was profound and lasting. Rader's brain learned to associate violence with pleasure, creating neural pathways that would strengthen throughout his life. This conditioning made violence psychologically necessary. His relationship with his own psychology became increasingly analytical and detached. Rader began to study his own thoughts and impulses with scientific curiosity, approaching his psychological development like a researcher studying an interesting phenomenon. This detachment enabled him to commit crimes. The escalation pattern that would define his entire criminal career began with early animal torture. Rader found that he needed increasingly intense experiences to achieve the same psychological satisfaction. driving him to develop more sophisticated and elaborate methods of violence. His early dark impulses were accompanied by the development of what psychologists call criminal thinking patterns. Rader began to justify his violent behavior through elaborate rationalizations. He convinced himself that his actions were justified by his psychological superiority. The psychological preparation process that began with animal torture would later be applied to human victims. Rader learned to study potential targets, identify vulnerabilities, and develop detailed plans for exploitation. This systematic approach to violence became his signature characteristic. His relationship with his own mortality began to evolve during these early experiences. Rader realized that he had the power to take life. This realization filled him with a sense of godlike power. He began to see himself as superior to mortals bound by morality. The psychological transformation that began with his first dark impulses would continue throughout adolescence. Rader was systematically training his mind to find satisfaction in violence, preparing himself for a criminal career that would span decades. His early dark impulses represented the psychological foundation upon which his entire criminal identity would be built. The torture of animals wasn't just childhood cruelty. It was the beginning of a systematic psychological development process that would culminate in transformation. The psychological patterns established during these early experiences would remain remarkably consistent throughout his criminal career. Rader's methods, motivations, and psychological responses would all trace back to the dark impulses that first emerged during childhood encounters with violence. The environmental triggers that enabled Dennis Rader's transformation from fantasy to action were a complex combination of opportunity and psychological readiness. By 1973, he had returned from military service with enhanced confidence in his ability to plan and execute complex operations. The structured environment of civilian life provided perfect camouflage. His marriage to Paula Dietz in 1971 created an unexpected psychological trigger. Rather than providing stability that might curb his violent impulses, the marriage gave him the perfect cover. A normal family man living a conventional life. This facade would become essential to his ability to operate undetected. The birth of his first child in 1975 represented another crucial environmental factor. Becoming a father didn't trigger paternal instincts or empathy in Rader. Instead, it reinforced his sense of control and dominance. He now had complete power over the most vulnerable of beings. This fed his psychological need for control. His employment at ADD Security Services beginning in 1974 provided him with unprecedented access to potential victims. Rader could legally enter homes, study security systems, and observe family routines. He was being paid to case potential crime scenes. This job was a psychological goldmine for a developing predator. The cultural environment of 1972's Wichita played a significant role in enabling his crimes. This was a trusting community where people felt safe leaving doors unlocked. Families maintained predictable routines. Social expectations emphasized conformity and respectability. Rader could blend in perfectly while exploiting this trust. His involvement with Christ Lutheran Church provided crucial psychological validation for his dual identity. The church community saw him as a devoted family man and faithful member. This positive reinforcement for his public persona made it easier to maintain his psychological compartmentalization between his two identities. The suburban geography of Wichita created ideal hunting conditions for Rader's psychological needs. Neighborhoods with single-family homes provided privacy for extended encounters with victims. The predictable layout of suburban streets allowed for careful surveillance and planning. Escape routes could be mapped in advance. His position as a compliance officer for the city beginning in 1991 added another layer of environmental enablement. Rader could now approach homes with official authority. He had legitimate reasons to interact with residents and observe their vulnerabilities. The uniform and badge provided psychological satisfaction and practical advantages. The technological environment of the era worked in Rader's favor in multiple ways. Limited surveillance capabilities meant fewer chances of being recorded. Communication systems were primitive, making it harder to coordinate rapid police responses. Forensic science was less advanced. DNA analysis wouldn't become routine until after his killing spree. His leadership role in the Boy Scouts provided another environmental trigger that fed his psychological needs. Working with children and families gave him access to potential victims while reinforcing his image as a trustworthy community member. The position satisfied his need for control and authority over others. The social expectations of masculinity in 1970s Kansas aligned perfectly with Rader's psychological presentation. Strong, silent men who kept their emotions private were considered ideal. This cultural norm provided cover for his lack of genuine emotional connection. His coldness was interpreted as stoic masculinity. His neighborhood environment provided constant opportunities for surveillance and victim selection. Rader could observe neighbors' routines while appearing to be doing normal activities like yard work or walking. He developed detailed knowledge of multiple families' patterns and vulnerabilities within his immediate area. The religious community's emphasis on forgiveness and redemption created an environment where Rader's occasional strange behavior was overlooked. When community members noticed anything odd, they were inclined to give him the benefit of doubt. His church membership provided a psychological shield against suspicion. Media coverage of other serial killers during this period provided Rader with both inspiration and instruction. He studied their methods and mistakes through news reports and true crime books. This environmental exposure to criminal techniques helped him refine his own psychological approach and avoid detection. The economic stability of his employment situations provided the psychological security necessary for his long-term planning. Rader didn't need to worry about survival needs, allowing him to focus entirely on his criminal projects. Financial security enabled him to acquire materials and maintain his double life without raising suspicions. His access to homes through work created repeated environmental triggers for his violent impulses. Each home visit was an opportunity to study potential victims and plan future attacks. The professional nature of these visits meant families welcomed him warmly, never suspecting his true psychological motivations. The community's trust in authority figures provided crucial environmental enablement for Rader's crimes. His various official positions meant that people readily opened their doors to him. This trust was a psychological weapon that he exploited ruthlessly while maintaining his facade of public service. The geographical isolation of many target homes provided the environmental conditions necessary for Rader's psychological needs. He required extended time with victims to fulfill his control fantasies. Remote or secluded properties offered the privacy necessary for his ritualistic approach to murder and torture. Family routines and schedules in suburban Wichita were predictable and observable. Rader could determine when homes would be occupied, when children would be alone, and when families would be most vulnerable. This environmental predictability was essential to his methodical planning process. The cultural emphasis on privacy and minding one's own business in Midwest communities worked in Rader's favor. Neighbors didn't interfere with each other's activities or report suspicious behavior readily. This social norm provided environmental cover for his surveillance and stalking activities. His involvement in multiple community organizations created a web of environmental connections that enhanced his victim selection capabilities. Through church, scouts, and work, Rader had access to information about numerous families. He could gather intelligence about potential targets through seemingly innocent social interactions. The lack of sophisticated communication networks meant that information about suspicious activities wasn't shared efficiently between neighborhoods or jurisdictions. Rader could operate in different areas without authorities recognizing patterns. This environmental limitation of law enforcement capabilities provided operational security. Seasonal changes in Kansas provided varying environmental conditions that Rader learned to exploit. Winter months offered longer darkness for surveillance and approach. Summer months provided opportunities when families left windows open or spent time in yards. He adapted his methods to environmental conditions. The psychological environment of his marriage provided unexpected triggers for his violent behavior, rather than domestic harmony, reducing his need for control elsewhere. Marital tensions and normal relationship conflicts seemed to increase his psychological pressure. Family stress became a trigger for victim selection and planning. His children's involvement in school and community activities provided environmental access to other families. Parent-teacher conferences, school events, and youth activities gave Rader opportunities to observe and interact with potential victims. His role as a father provided perfect camouflage for gathering intelligence. The environmental factor of changing police leadership and investigation techniques over his 30-year career provided ongoing opportunities for adaptation. Rader observed how law enforcement evolved and adjusted his methods accordingly. He learned from their investigative patterns and modified his behavior to avoid detection. Technology advances that might have threatened his activities were offset by his adaptability and insider knowledge. His work in security systems kept him informed about detection capabilities. He could stay ahead of technological developments that might expose his activities. The environmental trigger that ultimately led to his capture was his own psychological need for recognition and control. The return of media attention to BTK cases in the early 2000s created an irresistible environmental pressure for him to resume communication. His ego demanded acknowledgement of his crimes. The combination of all these environmental factors created the perfect psychological ecosystem for Rader's criminal career. Every aspect of his environment reinforced his ability to maintain his double life while providing opportunities for victim selection and attack. He had unconsciously constructed the ideal predatory environment. His environmental mastery was so complete that he operated for 30 years without serious suspicion falling on him. The environmental triggers that enabled his crimes were the same factors that made him appear to be an ideal citizen and community member. Dennis Rader's methodology development was a systematic process that evolved over years of careful planning and psychological refinement. Unlike impulsive killers who act on sudden urges, Rader approached murder like an engineer designing a complex system. Every element was calculated to maximize his psychological satisfaction while minimizing risk. His surveillance techniques became increasingly sophisticated through practice and observation. Rader would spend weeks or months studying potential victims before making any approach. He learned their daily routines, work schedules, and family patterns. This wasn't casual observation. It was professional-level intelligence gathering conducted by someone who understood operational security. The development of his victim selection criteria revealed his psychological priorities and operational thinking. Rader wasn't attracted to specific physical types or demographics. He selected victims based on accessibility, isolation, and vulnerability windows. His criteria were purely tactical, designed to maximize his control while minimizing resistance and detection risks. His approach methodology combined elements of his military training with his security systems knowledge. Rader learned to identify and exploit weaknesses in home security, just as he had been trained to identify tactical vulnerabilities. He approached each target like a military objective, requiring reconnaissance, planning, and precise execution. The evolution of his restraint techniques showed his systematic approach to psychological control. Rader experimented with different methods of binding victims, testing which approaches provided maximum helplessness while allowing him to maintain complete dominance. He refined these techniques through practice, treating each encounter as a learning opportunity. His psychological torture methodology was perhaps his most sophisticated development. Rader understood that physical control was only the beginning of his true objective. He developed techniques for psychological manipulation that would maximize his victims' terror and helplessness. This wasn't random cruelty. It was systematically designed psychological warfare. The development of his communication strategy with law enforcement revealed his need for recognition and control. Rader crafted letters and phone calls designed to demonstrate his superiority over investigators. He wanted them to know he was in control of the game. These communications were psychological weapons intended to spread fear. His signature methodology evolved through careful consideration of what would satisfy his psychological needs. The bind, torture, kill sequence wasn't random violence. It was a carefully designed ritual that provided maximum psychological satisfaction while serving his need for control and dominance over every aspect of his victim's final experiences. The timing methodology that Rader developed showed his understanding of both victim psychology and investigative procedures. He learned optimal timing for approaches, duration of encounters, and spacing between crimes. This wasn't intuitive knowledge. It was systematically developed through observation and analysis of law enforcement patterns. His evidence management techniques revealed his sophisticated understanding of forensic procedures. Rader knew what evidence to avoid leaving and what traces were inevitable. He developed methods for minimizing forensic exposure while preserving trophies that satisfied his psychological needs for reliving and controlling his experiences. The geographic methodology he employed showed strategic thinking about operational security. Rader varied his hunting grounds to avoid establishing patterns that investigators could predict. He understood that geographic profiling was an investigative tool and deliberately obscured his operational base to maintain his double life. His role-playing methodology allowed him to approach victims without arousing immediate suspicion. Rader would assume various personas: serviceman, survey taker, lost driver that provided legitimate reasons for contact. These weren't spontaneous deceptions. They were carefully rehearsed psychological masks designed for specific operational purposes. The development of his trophy collection system served multiple psychological functions while maintaining operational security. Rader collected specific items that allowed him to relive and control his experiences psychologically, but he was careful to select trophies that wouldn't be immediately missed or easily traced back to him. His methodology for maintaining psychological compartmentalization became increasingly sophisticated over time. Rader developed techniques for switching between his public persona and his predatory identity without leaving psychological residue that might raise suspicions. This wasn't natural ability. It was a systematically developed skill. The evolution of his escape and evasion procedures showed his understanding of law enforcement response patterns. Rader developed specific routes and timing designed to maximize his safety after each attack. He studied police patrol schedules and emergency response procedures to optimize his operational security. His psychological manipulation methodology extended beyond his immediate victims to their families and the broader community. Rader understood that spreading terror was part of his psychological satisfaction. He developed techniques for maximizing the psychological impact of his crimes on the entire community. The development of his research methodology allowed him to continuously improve his operational effectiveness. Rader studied police procedures, forensic techniques, and investigative methods through books, media coverage, and professional contacts. He treated this as continuing education for his criminal career. His methodology for victim approach combined psychological manipulation with tactical surprise. Rader developed techniques for gaining entry to homes and establishing control before victims could react effectively. These weren't lucky breaks. They were systematically developed procedures based on his understanding of human psychology. The refinement of his killing methodology showed his evolution from amateur to expert predator. Rader's early murders were less sophisticated than his later crimes. He learned from each encounter, refining his techniques to maximize both his psychological satisfaction and operational security. His communication security methodology revealed his understanding of investigation techniques. Rader developed methods for contacting police and media while minimizing the risk of identification. He understood trace evidence, voice analysis, and communication monitoring. His security measures were sophisticated and effective. The development of his psychological conditioning techniques allowed him to maintain his predatory identity over decades. Rader created personal rituals and mental exercises that kept his violent impulses sharp during inactive periods. He treated his psychology like a weapon that required constant maintenance. His methodology for exploiting his professional positions showed strategic thinking about operational advantages. Rader carefully leveraged his various jobs to gain access to potential victims and gather intelligence. He understood how to maximize the criminal potential of legitimate positions without raising suspicions. The evolution of his fantasy reinforcement methodology served to maintain his psychological satisfaction between crimes. Rader developed techniques for reliving and elaborating on his experiences through mental replay and trophy interaction. These weren't random obsessions. They were systematically designed psychological maintenance procedures. His methodology for social camouflage became increasingly sophisticated as his crimes continued. Rader learned to not only avoid suspicion, but to actively cultivate a positive reputation that would shield him from investigation. He understood that being seen as exemplary was better protection than simply being invisible. The development of his risk assessment methodology allowed him to operate for 30 years without serious investigation. Rader learned to evaluate and minimize every aspect of operational risk while maintaining the psychological satisfaction he required. This balance between safety and satisfaction was his greatest methodological achievement. His psychological pressure release methodology allowed him to manage the stress of maintaining his double life. Rader developed techniques for releasing psychological tension without compromising his operational security or raising suspicions among family and colleagues. The refinement of his victim control methodology showed his understanding of human psychology under extreme stress. Rader learned to maintain psychological dominance over multiple victims simultaneously while preventing organized resistance or escape attempts. This required sophisticated understanding of group psychology. His methodology for investigation monitoring allowed him to stay ahead of law enforcement efforts. Rader developed techniques for gathering intelligence about police investigations without raising suspicions. He understood how to track investigative progress and adjust his behavior accordingly. The development of his legacy methodology revealed his long-term thinking about his criminal career. Rader wasn't just committing crimes. He was building a psychological monument to his superiority. His methodology was designed to create lasting fear and demonstrate his mastery over both victims and investigators. His final methodological evolution involved his communication strategy that ultimately led to his capture. Rader's need for recognition overcame his operational security considerations. The methodology that had protected him for decades was finally compromised by his psychological need for acknowledgement and control. Dennis Rader's victim psychology and selection process revealed the calculating mind of a predator who understood human vulnerability at a deeply disturbing level. Unlike killers driven by rage or sexual impulse, Rader approached victim selection like a hunter studying prey. He was looking for specific psychological and situational characteristics that would maximize his control. His understanding of family dynamics allowed him to identify households where he could maintain psychological dominance over multiple victims simultaneously. Rader studied how families interacted, who held authority, and how members responded to crisis. He selected families where his intervention would create maximum psychological chaos and helplessness. The psychological profile of his ideal victim centered on accessibility rather than physical characteristics. Rader wasn't attracted to specific ages, genders, or appearances. He was attracted to vulnerability windows, moments when potential victims would be isolated, distracted, or unable to mount effective resistance or call for help. His surveillance methodology revealed sophisticated understanding of human routine psychology. Rader observed how people develop predictable patterns and unconscious habits. He learned to identify the psychological comfort zones that made people careless about security. These behavioral patterns became his hunting guidelines. The psychology of trust exploitation was central to Rader's victim selection strategy. He specifically targeted people who were naturally trusting or who would trust him due to his various official positions. Rader understood that psychological trust was a weapon he could use to gain access and control. His selection criteria included careful analysis of victim response psychology under stress. Rader preferred victims who he believed would become psychologically paralyzed rather than fight back effectively. He looked for psychological indicators that suggested compliance rather than resistance when confronted with extreme terror. The geographic psychology of his victim selection showed his understanding of community dynamics and social isolation patterns. Rader chose victims who were geographically isolated or who lived in areas where screams wouldn't be heard. He understood the psychology of suburban privacy and exploited it ruthlessly. His temporal selection methodology revealed his understanding of victim psychology during different time periods. Rader learned when people were most psychologically vulnerable: late evenings, early mornings, times when mental defenses were naturally lower. He timed his approaches to coincide with maximum psychological vulnerability. The family structure analysis that guided his selection process showed sophisticated understanding of group psychology. Rader preferred families where he could use psychological leverage, threatening children to control parents, or using family bonds as weapons of psychological torture. Family love became his tactical advantage. His victim age preference revealed psychological motivations beyond simple targeting convenience. Rader was drawn to scenarios where he could demonstrate psychological dominance over parents protecting children. The family protection instinct provided him with powerful psychological leverage and maximum opportunities for inflicting terror. The psychological typology he developed for victim selection included specific personality traits that would enhance his satisfaction. Rader preferred victims who were naturally fearful or anxious, as their terror responses would be more intense. He could identify these psychological characteristics through careful observation. His understanding of victim psychology under extreme duress allowed him to maintain control throughout extended encounters. Rader studied how people react psychologically to mortal terror and developed techniques for exploiting these responses. He knew exactly how to break down psychological resistance. The selection methodology he used for secondary victims within families showed his understanding of psychological manipulation dynamics. Rader would identify which family member was most psychologically vulnerable and use them to control others. Children were often his psychological weapons against parents. His victim approach psychology involved careful analysis of how different people responded to authority figures and unexpected visitors. Rader developed different personas and approaches based on his psychological assessment of each target. He tailored his manipulation to individual psychological profiles. The psychological impact assessment he conducted for each potential victim showed his understanding of trauma psychology. Rader wanted victims who would provide maximum psychological satisfaction through their terror responses. He was essentially conducting psychological interviews through surveillance. His victim isolation methodology revealed understanding of social psychology and community dynamics. Rader chose victims who were socially isolated or whose disappearance wouldn't be immediately noticed. He understood how social connections could either protect or endanger potential victims. The psychological vulnerability windows he exploited showed sophisticated understanding of human stress patterns and life circumstances. Rader targeted people during psychologically vulnerable periods, recent moves, family problems, financial stress. He understood that existing psychological pressure made people easier targets. His analysis of victim compliance psychology allowed him to predict and control behavior during attacks. Rader studied how different personality types responded to commands under extreme stress. He learned to identify people who would follow orders versus those who might resist or try to escape. The psychological intimidation techniques he developed were specifically tailored to individual victim personalities. Rader understood that different people had different psychological breaking points and fear triggers. He customized his terror techniques to maximize effectiveness against specific personality types. His victim communication psychology showed understanding of how terror affects cognitive function and decision-making. Rader learned to communicate with victims in ways that maximize their psychological helplessness while maintaining his control. He understood the psychology of command and compliance under duress. The psychological profiling system he used to evaluate potential victims was remarkably sophisticated. Rader could assess personality types, stress responses, and vulnerability factors through limited observation. This wasn't intuitive ability, it was systematically developed skill in reading human psychology. His understanding of victim family psychology allowed him to exploit emotional bonds as weapons. Rader learned to use family members' love for each other as psychological leverage. The deeper the emotional connections, the more psychological power he could exert through threats and manipulation. The victim selection timing methodology he developed showed understanding of psychological rhythms and vulnerability cycles. Rader learned when people were most psychologically exposed during routine activities, moments of distraction, periods of reduced alertness. He timed his approaches to coincide with these psychological windows. His psychological assessment of victim recovery potential revealed his long-term thinking about trauma and its effects. Rader wasn't just interested in immediate psychological domination. He wanted to inflict lasting psychological damage that would extend his control beyond the actual encounter. The victim interaction psychology he developed allowed him to maintain psychological dominance throughout extended encounters. Rader understood how to prevent victims from developing psychological coping mechanisms or resistance strategies. He kept them in a state of constant psychological vulnerability. His psychological manipulation of victim expectations showed sophisticated understanding of hope and despair dynamics. Rader would create false hopes of survival to increase psychological investment, then destroy those hopes to maximize despair. This psychological manipulation was more important to him than physical torture. The victim psychology research he conducted through his crimes provided him with increasingly sophisticated understanding of human responses to extreme terror. Each encounter was a psychological experiment that informed his future victim selection and manipulation strategies. His psychological categorization of different victim types allowed him to develop specialized approaches for maximum effectiveness. Rader understood that mothers, fathers, children, and elderly victims each had different psychological vulnerabilities that required different exploitation strategies. The psychological legacy he intended to create through his victim selection showed his understanding of community trauma psychology. Rader wasn't just targeting individual victims. He was targeting entire communities' sense of safety and trust. His victim selection was designed to maximize psychological impact beyond the immediate crimes. His psychological study of victim resistance patterns allowed him to develop countermeasures against potential escape or defense attempts. Rader learned to identify victims who might fight back and develop psychological techniques for preventing or overcoming resistance before it could become effective. The psychological satisfaction he derived from victim selection was as important as the crimes themselves. Rader experienced intense psychological pleasure from the hunting and selection process. The psychological dominance began long before the actual physical encounter, during the surveillance and selection phase. Dennis Rader's peak psychological state occurred during the late 1970s and early 1980s when his confidence, methodology, and psychological satisfaction reached their maximum convergence. This wasn't a brief moment of criminal intensity. It was a sustained period where his psychological development, operational capabilities, and environmental advantages aligned perfectly. His psychological confidence during this period was characterized by a sense of complete invincibility and superiority over both victims and investigators. Rader felt that he had mastered every aspect of his criminal craft. He believed himself to be psychologically untouchable. This confidence enabled him to take greater risks while maintaining his operational security. The psychological satisfaction he derived from his crimes reached unprecedented levels during this peak period. Rader had refined his techniques to maximize every aspect of the psychological experience. From victim selection through disposal, every element was optimized to provide maximum psychological reward. He was experiencing the full realization of decades of psychological development. His psychological state during actual crimes was characterized by complete focus and absorption. Rader described feeling like he was in a heightened state of consciousness where every detail was crystal clear. Time seemed to slow down. His psychological awareness was completely attuned to every aspect of victim response and environmental control. The psychological control he exercised over his victims during this period was total and sophisticated. Rader had learned to read and manipulate victim psychology with expert precision. He could predict and control emotional responses, direct psychological states, create and destroy hope at will. This level of psychological mastery provided him with intense satisfaction. His psychological relationship with law enforcement during this peak period was characterized by contempt mixed with intellectual challenge. Rader felt superior to the investigators pursuing him, but he also enjoyed the psychological game of staying ahead of their efforts. Their inability to catch him provided constant validation of his psychological superiority. The psychological integration of his double life reached its most sophisticated level during this period. Rader could switch between his public persona and predatory identity seamlessly. The psychological compartmentalization was so complete that no trace of his criminal psychology leaked into his public interactions. This integration felt natural and effortless. His psychological state during victim encounters was characterized by complete emotional detachment combined with intense psychological engagement. Rader felt no empathy or human connection with his victims, but he was completely absorbed in observing and controlling their psychological responses. They were fascinating psychological experiments rather than human beings. The psychological reward system he had developed was functioning at peak efficiency during this period. Every aspect of his crimes provided intense psychological satisfaction. The planning, surveillance, approach, control, and aftermath all contributed to a comprehensive psychological experience that met all his emotional needs. His psychological perception of risk during this peak period was characterized by confidence that bordered on recklessness. Rader felt that his psychological sophistication made him immune to normal investigative techniques. He believed that his understanding of human psychology gave him insurmountable advantages over law enforcement. The psychological energy he derived from his crimes was at its highest during this period. Rather than feeling depleted by the stress of maintaining his double life, Rader felt energized and empowered. His criminal activities enhanced rather than undermined his psychological functioning. The crimes were psychologically nourishing rather than draining. His psychological state during the cooling-off periods between crimes was characterized by intense anticipation and planning. Rader would spend months savoring his previous crimes while preparing for the next. This psychological replay and preparation provided sustained satisfaction that carried him through inactive periods. The psychological dominance he felt over his community reached its peak during this period. Rader knew that his crimes were spreading terror throughout Wichita. This community-wide psychological impact provided him with a sense of godlike power. He was controlling the emotional state of an entire city through his actions. His psychological relationship with his own identity during this peak period was characterized by complete integration of his predatory nature. Rader no longer felt any internal conflict about his dual existence. The psychological splitting had become so complete that both identities felt natural and authentic. The psychological satisfaction he derived from media coverage reached its maximum during this period. Rader felt that the attention and fear his crimes generated provided validation of his psychological superiority. The media coverage was proof that he had achieved psychological dominance over not just individual victims, but society itself. His psychological state during family interactions remained completely unaffected by his criminal activities. Rader could participate in normal family life immediately before or after committing murders without any psychological spillover. This compartmentalization was so complete that his family never sensed anything unusual about his psychological state. The psychological control he exercised over his own emotions and impulses was at its most sophisticated during this peak period. Rader could delay gratification, control his violent urges, and maintain his facades indefinitely. This psychological self-control enabled him to optimize his criminal activities while maintaining perfect social camouflage. His psychological perception of his victims during this period was completely dehumanized. Rader didn't see them as people with lives, feelings, or value. They were objects to be used for his psychological satisfaction. This complete objectification allowed him to inflict maximum suffering without any psychological distress. The psychological pleasure he derived from victims' suffering reached its peak intensity during this period. Rader had trained his psychological reward system to find maximum satisfaction in others' terror and pain. This wasn't natural sadism, it was a deliberately cultivated psychological response that had reached its full development. His psychological state during the actual killing moments was characterized by complete calm and control. Rader felt no excitement, anger, or emotion during the killings themselves. They were simply the necessary conclusion to his psychological experiments. The killing was less important than the psychological domination that preceded it. The psychological aftermath of his crimes provided sustained satisfaction that could last for months. Rader would relive every psychological moment through memory and trophies. These mental replays provided ongoing psychological nourishment that maintained his emotional equilibrium between crimes. His psychological relationship with authority and social rules during this peak period was characterized by complete contempt. Rader felt that normal social constraints didn't apply to him. His psychological superiority placed him above conventional morality. Rules were for ordinary people who lacked his psychological sophistication. The psychological confidence he felt in his investigative countermeasures was at its highest during this period. Rader believed that his understanding of police psychology and procedures made him essentially uncatchable. He felt psychologically invulnerable to normal investigative techniques. His psychological state during public appearances and community interactions was characterized by hidden superiority and secret amusement. Rader enjoyed the psychological irony of being praised and trusted by the same community he was terrorizing. This secret knowledge provided constant psychological satisfaction. The psychological integration of violence into his identity was complete during this peak period. Rader no longer experienced his violent impulses as intrusive thoughts or compulsions. They were natural expressions of his psychological nature. Violence felt as normal and necessary as any other psychological function. His psychological perception of his own mortality and legacy during this period was characterized by grandiose thinking about his historical significance. Rader believed that his crimes would be remembered and studied for decades. This sense of psychological immortality through infamy provided additional motivation and satisfaction. The psychological state he achieved during extended victim encounters represented the pinnacle of his criminal development. Rader could maintain complete psychological control for hours while extracting maximum satisfaction from every moment. These extended psychological experiments were the ultimate expression of his predatory nature. His psychological relationship with his own conscience during this peak period was characterized by complete silence. Rader felt no guilt, remorse, or moral conflict about his crimes. His psychological development had eliminated normal human emotions that might interfere with his activities. The psychological satisfaction he derived from his intelligence and planning abilities reached its maximum during this period. Rader felt that his crimes demonstrated his intellectual superiority over both victims and investigators. The psychological complexity of his operations provided additional satisfaction beyond the violence itself. His psychological state during this peak period represented the full realization of his transformation from Dennis Rader into BTK. The psychological evolution that had been developing for decades had reached its complete expression. He had become the perfect psychological predator he had always intended to be. Dennis Rader's control mechanisms were the psychological and practical systems that allowed him to maintain his double life for 30 years without detection. These weren't random behaviors or lucky circumstances. They were carefully developed and constantly refined strategies for managing every aspect of his dual existence while satisfying his predatory psychological needs. His primary psychological control mechanism was compartmentalization, so complete that it functioned like multiple personality disorder without the clinical dysfunction. Rader could switch between his public persona and predatory identity instantly and completely. Each identity had its own emotional responses, behavioral patterns, and memory systems that operated independently. The temporal control mechanism he developed allowed him to manage his violent impulses across extended time periods. Rader could delay gratification for months or years when necessary for operational security. This wasn't natural patience, it was trained psychological control that enabled him to optimize timing for maximum satisfaction and minimum risk. His emotional control mechanism eliminated normal human responses that might compromise his operations or reveal his true nature. Rader had trained himself to feel no guilt, empathy, or remorse about his crimes, but he could simulate these emotions perfectly when interacting with family and community members who expected normal human responses. The social control mechanism he employed involved actively cultivating a reputation that would shield him from suspicion. Rader didn't just avoid drawing attention, he deliberately created positive attention that would make him seem like an ideal citizen. This proactive reputation management was a sophisticated form of psychological camouflage. His professional control mechanism involved leveraging his various jobs to serve his criminal activities while appearing to be a dedicated employee. Rader used his positions at ADT Security and as a compliance officer to gather intelligence and access potential victims. His work performance was deliberately exemplary to maintain these valuable covers. The family control mechanism he developed allowed him to maintain normal domestic relationships while harboring and acting on murderous impulses. Rader could be a functioning husband and father without any psychological spillover from his criminal activities. His family became unwitting accomplices in his cover identity. His communication control mechanism governed every interaction with law enforcement, media, and the public regarding his crimes. Rader carefully managed what information he revealed and when. His letters and calls were calculated to maintain his psychological dominance while avoiding providing useful investigative leads. The geographical control mechanism he employed involved systematic management of his operational areas to avoid creating detectable patterns. Rader varied his hunting grounds, approach routes, and disposal methods to prevent investigators from developing useful geographic profiles. He understood the psychology of pattern recognition and deliberately obscured his patterns. His evidence control mechanism was designed to minimize forensic exposure while preserving trophies that satisfied his psychological needs. Rader understood what evidence was unavoidable and what could be controlled. He developed techniques for cleaning crime scenes while retaining personal mementos that allowed him to relive his experiences. The timing control mechanism he developed governed when he committed crimes, communicated with authorities, and resumed normal activities. Rader understood the psychological rhythms of investigations and media attention. He timed his activities to maximize his psychological satisfaction while minimizing investigative pressure. His stress control mechanism allowed him to manage the psychological pressure of maintaining his double life without developing detectable symptoms. Rader channeled stress into planning and preparation rather than allowing it to manifest as behavioral changes that might raise suspicions among family or colleagues. The financial control mechanism he employed ensured that his criminal activities never created suspicious financial patterns. Rader was careful not to spend money in ways that might raise questions. His crimes weren't motivated by financial gain, which eliminated a major source of potential evidence and suspicion. His technology control mechanism evolved as surveillance and communication technologies advanced. Rader stayed informed about forensic developments and adjusted his methods accordingly. He understood how technology could both threaten and enhance his operations, and he adapted continuously to maintain his advantages. The relationship control mechanism he developed governed his interactions with everyone in his social and professional circles. Rader maintained consistent personality presentations that never varied in ways that might raise questions. He was psychologically disciplined enough to never let his guard down, even in casual interactions. His impulse control mechanism allowed him to manage his violent urges without compromising his operational security. When Rader felt the need to kill but conditions weren't optimal, he could redirect that energy into planning and preparation. This psychological control prevented him from making impulsive mistakes. The information control mechanism he employed governed what he learned about his own cases and how he used that knowledge. Rader gathered intelligence about investigations through legitimate channels while being careful not to show suspicious interest. He used this information to adjust his behavior and methods. His physical control mechanism involved maintaining his health and capabilities to ensure he could continue his criminal activities effectively. Rader understood that physical fitness and mental sharpness were essential to his operations. He maintained himself like a professional operator preparing for long-term missions. The psychological control mechanism he used to manage his fantasies and memories prevented them from interfering with his public life. Rader could compartmentalize his violent thoughts and experiences so completely that they never affected his professional or family interactions. This mental discipline was remarkable and disturbing. His documentation control mechanism governed how he recorded and preserved information about his crimes. Rader kept detailed records that satisfied his psychological needs while being careful about format and storage. These records were psychological treasures that had to be protected from discovery. The behavioral control mechanism he developed ensured that his public behavior never varied in ways that might correlate with his criminal activities. Rader maintained consistent personality patterns regardless of his recent activities. Family and colleagues never noticed mood changes or behavioral shifts that might indicate his dual life. His surveillance control mechanism allowed him to gather intelligence about potential victims and law enforcement activities without being detected. Rader could observe and follow people while appearing to be engaged in normal activities. This surveillance capability was essential to his victim selection and operational security. The communication security control mechanism he employed protected his identity during contacts with media and law enforcement. Rader understood voice analysis, handwriting comparison, and other identification techniques. He developed countermeasures that allowed him to communicate while maintaining his anonymity. His trophy control mechanism balanced his psychological need for mementos with operational security requirements. Rader selected and preserved items that provided maximum psychological satisfaction while minimizing the risk of discovery. The trophies had to be significant enough to trigger memories, but innocuous enough to avoid suspicion. The operational security control mechanism he maintained governed every aspect of his criminal activities from planning through aftermath. Rader approached each crime like a military operation with detailed security protocols. This systematic approach to security enabled his long criminal career. His psychological maintenance control mechanism ensured that his predatory identity remained sharp and focused during inactive periods. Rader used fantasy, trophy interaction, and mental rehearsal to maintain his psychological edge. He treated his criminal psychology like a weapon that required constant maintenance. The social engineering control mechanism he employed allowed him to manipulate people and situations to serve his criminal purposes. Rader understood human psychology well enough to create circumstances that favored his operations. He could influence people's behavior without them realizing they were being manipulated. His investigation countermeasure control mechanism involved systematic efforts to monitor and misdirect law enforcement activities. Rader studied investigative techniques and developed specific countermeasures for each threat. He understood how investigations worked and how to exploit their limitations. The legacy control mechanism he developed governed his long-term thinking about his criminal career and its impact. Rader wanted his crimes to be remembered and studied, but he also wanted to control how they were interpreted. This mechanism influenced his communication strategy and operational choices. His final control mechanism was the psychological switch that would eventually lead to his downfall: his need for recognition and validation. This was the one control mechanism that ultimately failed, when his ego-driven desire for acknowledgement overcame his operational security discipline and led to his capture. The escalation and pressure points in Dennis Rader's psychological development reveal how external circumstances and internal drives created mounting tension that drove him toward increasingly bold and risky behavior. These weren't random behavioral changes, but systematic responses to specific psychological and environmental pressures that accumulated over his 30-year criminal career. His initial pressure point emerged from the gap between his elaborate fantasies and the reality of his early crimes. Rader's first murders didn't provide the complete psychological satisfaction he had anticipated. The reality couldn't match the perfection of his mental rehearsals. This disappointment created psychological pressure to escalate his methods and extend his control over victims. The psychological pressure created by media coverage of his crimes produced a complex escalation dynamic. Rader craved recognition for his psychological sophistication, but early coverage focused on the brutality rather than his intelligence. This misrepresentation created pressure to communicate directly with media and law enforcement to correct their misunderstanding of his psychological motivations. His professional advancement created unexpected psychological pressure points that influenced his criminal behavior. As Rader gained authority in his legitimate jobs, his need for psychological dominance in his criminal activities intensified. Correspondingly, success in his public life created pressure to achieve even greater success in his predatory activities. The birth and development of his children created significant psychological pressure that manifested in his criminal escalation patterns. Rather than triggering paternal instincts that might reduce his violent impulses, fatherhood intensified his need for control and dominance. His children became psychological reminders of his power over vulnerable beings. His marriage relationship produced ongoing psychological pressure that required escalation in his criminal activities for relief. Normal marital conflicts and domestic responsibilities created stress that Rader could only relieve through increasing his psychological dominance over victims. Family harmony paradoxically increased his need for violence. The psychological pressure created by periods of criminal inactivity drove him toward increasingly risky behavior to achieve satisfaction. During gaps between murders, Rader experienced mounting psychological tension that could only be relieved through criminal activity. These pressure periods often preceded his most dangerous and elaborate crimes. His aging process created biological and psychological pressure points that influenced his criminal escalation. As Rader entered middle age, he felt increasing urgency to achieve his maximum criminal potential before physical decline limited his capabilities. This temporal pressure drove him toward more ambitious and risky operations. The evolution of law enforcement capabilities created external pressure that paradoxically drove escalation rather than restraint. As investigative techniques became more sophisticated, Rader felt increased pressure to demonstrate his psychological superiority by committing crimes that would showcase his ability to outwit improved methods. His community involvement created mounting psychological pressure from the contradiction between his public persona and private reality. The more respected and trusted he became in legitimate roles, the greater the psychological pressure to prove his dominance through criminal acts. Success in his public life intensified rather than satisfied his predatory needs. The psychological pressure created by cold case investigations and renewed media attention produced his most dangerous escalation period. When his crimes received fresh attention years later, Rader felt compelled to reassert his psychological dominance and correct misconceptions about his motivations and capabilities. His professional knowledge of security systems and law enforcement procedures created pressure to demonstrate his superiority over these protective measures. The more Rader learned about security and investigation techniques through his work, the greater his compulsion to prove these measures were ineffective against his psychological sophistication. The pressure point created by his need for psychological immortality drove increasingly elaborate and risky communication with authorities. Rader wanted his crimes to be remembered and studied for decades. This legacy pressure overcame his operational security considerations and drove him toward behaviors that would ultimately lead to his capture. His psychological pressure from maintaining perfect compartmentalization for decades created internal stress that required escalation for relief. The constant psychological discipline of maintaining his double life created mounting tension that could only be relieved through increasingly intense criminal experiences. The pressure created by his grandiose self-perception versus external validation drove escalation in both criminal behavior and communication. Rader believed himself to be a criminal mastermind, but public perception didn't match his self-image. This validation pressure drove him to more elaborate demonstrations of his psychological superiority. His sexual psychology created escalation pressure as normal arousal patterns became insufficient for satisfaction. Rader's conditioning toward violence-linked arousal meant he needed increasingly intense experiences to achieve the same psychological reward. This created a biological pressure toward escalation that was difficult to control. The psychological pressure created by his trophy collection drove escalation in risk-taking behavior. As Rader accumulated mementos from his crimes, he felt increased pressure to add more significant trophies that required more dangerous criminal acts to obtain. The collection itself became a pressure point driving escalation. His relationship with fear as a psychological stimulant created pressure for escalation as his tolerance increased. Rader had conditioned himself to find excitement in dangerous situations, but his psychological tolerance meant he needed increasingly risky scenarios to achieve the same stimulation level. The pressure point created by his analytical relationship with his own psychology drove escalation as he studied his criminal development. Rader approached his psychological evolution like a scientific experiment, which created pressure to push boundaries and test limits to gather more psychological data about his own capabilities. His competitive psychology created pressure to exceed other criminals' achievements that he studied through media coverage and true crime materials. Rader didn't want to be just another serial killer, he wanted to be recognized as psychologically superior to other criminals. This competitive pressure drove escalation in sophistication and boldness. The psychological pressure created by his need for complete control over his criminal narrative drove escalation in communication and risk-taking. Rader couldn't tolerate misconceptions about his motivations or methods. This need for narrative control created pressure to provide corrections and clarifications that compromised his operational security. His aging and mortality awareness created time pressure that drove escalation in criminal frequency and boldness. As Rader realized his criminal career had temporal limitations, he felt increased pressure to achieve his maximum potential before physical or mental decline ended his activities. The pressure point created by technological advancement drove escalation as Rader attempted to stay ahead of improving investigative capabilities. Each advance in forensic science created pressure to demonstrate his ability to adapt and overcome new challenges. This technological pressure drove increasingly sophisticated countermeasures. His psychological pressure from the gap between his criminal sophistication and investigative understanding drove escalation in educational communication. Rader wanted law enforcement to understand and appreciate his psychological complexity. This teaching pressure drove him toward increasingly detailed and risky communications. The pressure created by his need for psychological validation from the criminal justice system drove escalation toward eventual capture. Rader wanted professional acknowledgement of his criminal achievements from the experts who had been trying to catch him. This validation pressure ultimately overcame his survival instincts. His legacy pressure created escalation in documentation and preservation of his criminal achievements. Rader wanted detailed records of his psychological development and criminal career for future study. This documentation pressure drove behaviors that created evidence trails leading to his capture. The psychological pressure created by his dual identity integration drove escalation as the boundaries between his personas became increasingly blurred. The more successful his compartmentalization became, the greater the pressure to demonstrate the superiority of his predatory identity over his public persona. His final escalation pressure point was created by his need for recognition and control over his criminal legacy. The combination of renewed media attention and his aging psychology created irresistible pressure to reassert his dominance and ensure proper understanding of his criminal achievements. The ultimate pressure point that led to his downfall was his psychological inability to accept anonymity and obscurity. Rader's grandiose self-perception created pressure that eventually exceeded his survival instincts and operational security discipline. His need for recognition became stronger than his need for freedom. His escalation pattern throughout his criminal career followed a consistent psychological trajectory from fantasy fulfillment through methodological refinement to legacy management. Each pressure point drove specific escalation behaviors that ultimately created the evidence trail and behavioral patterns that enabled his capture. Dennis Rader's psychological relationship with the investigation process was complex and evolved throughout his 30-year criminal career. Unlike most criminals who fear law enforcement, Rader viewed the investigation as an intellectual game where he could demonstrate his psychological superiority over trained professionals. This mindset profoundly influenced both his criminal behavior and the investigation itself. His initial psychological response to being investigated was a mixture of excitement and contempt. Rader felt thrilled that his crimes had triggered such extensive law enforcement attention, but he also felt superior to the investigators, who couldn't understand his psychological motivations or predict his behavior patterns. This emotional combination drove his decision to communicate directly with authorities. The psychological satisfaction he derived from staying ahead of the investigation became a central motivation for his continued criminal activity. Rader wasn't just killing for psychological domination over victims, he was also demonstrating psychological dominance over the entire law enforcement community. Each successful evasion validated his sense of intellectual superiority. His psychological analysis of investigative techniques revealed sophisticated understanding of law enforcement psychology and procedures. Rader studied how investigators thought, what evidence they prioritized, and how they developed theories about criminal behavior. He used this knowledge to deliberately obscure patterns and misdirect investigative efforts. The psychological pressure created by periods of intensive investigation produced complex responses in Rader's behavior. Rather than laying low to avoid detection, increased investigative attention often triggered his need to prove his superiority through more elaborate crimes or communications. Pressure from investigation became a psychological stimulant rather than a deterrent. His psychological relationship with individual investigators was characterized by a desire for recognition and intellectual acknowledgement. Rader wanted the professionals pursuing him to appreciate his psychological sophistication and criminal innovation. He felt that successful investigators should recognize and respect his abilities even while trying to capture him. The psychological impact of investigative failures on Rader was profound validation of his superior intellect and planning capabilities. Each time investigators followed false leads or developed incorrect theories, Rader felt his psychological superiority confirmed. These failures fed his grandiose self-perception and motivated continued criminal activity. His psychological response to being profiled by behavioral experts revealed his need for accurate understanding of his motivations. When psychological profiles were inaccurate, Rader felt compelled to provide corrections through his communications. He wanted his psychology to be properly understood and documented for posterity. The psychological game he played with investigators through his communications was designed to demonstrate intellectual dominance while maintaining operational security. Rader's letters and calls were carefully crafted to show his superior knowledge of the investigation while revealing minimal useful information. This communication strategy satisfied his ego while protecting his identity. His psychological monitoring of investigation progress became an obsession that influenced his criminal timeline and methodology. Rader would adjust his behavior based on investigative developments, sometimes accelerating his activities when attention decreased or modifying his methods when investigators came close to useful insights. The psychological satisfaction he derived from investigative misdirection became almost as important as the crimes themselves. Rader took pride in leading investigators down false paths and wasting their resources on incorrect theories. This misdirection was a form of psychological warfare that demonstrated his intellectual superiority. His psychological response to cold case investigations revealed his complex relationship with time and legacy. When his crimes received renewed attention years later, Rader felt both validated by the continued interest and compelled to reassert his relevance. Cold case attention triggered his psychological need to prove he was still intellectually superior. The psychological impact of advanced forensic techniques on Rader was a mixture of concern and competitive challenge. Rather than being purely fearful of improved investigative capabilities, he felt challenged to demonstrate his ability to adapt and overcome new detection methods. Each forensic advance became a psychological test of his superiority. His psychological relationship with media coverage of the investigation was complex and evolved over time. Initially, Rader felt frustrated when coverage focused on investigative efforts rather than his psychological sophistication. Later, he began using media attention as a tool for communicating with investigators and the public. The psychological pressure created by investigative task forces and specialized units produced escalation in Rader's behavior rather than retreat. The formation of dedicated investigative teams validated the importance of his crimes while challenging his ability to remain superior to concentrated professional attention. This pressure often triggered more elaborate criminal acts. His psychological analysis of investigative mistakes and oversights provided him with ongoing intelligence about law enforcement capabilities and limitations. Rader studied what investigators missed and why, using this information to refine his methods and avoid future detection. He treated investigation failures as educational opportunities. The psychological satisfaction he derived from investigative longevity became a source of pride and motivation. The fact that his case remained unsolved for decades validated his psychological superiority and criminal sophistication. Long-term investigative failure proved his intellectual dominance over the entire law enforcement system. His psychological response to geographic and temporal profiling revealed his understanding of investigative methodologies and his efforts to defeat them. Rader deliberately varied his patterns to prevent useful profile development while maintaining his psychological satisfaction from the crimes. He understood profiling psychology and developed specific countermeasures. The psychological impact of witness descriptions and composite sketches on Rader was minimal due to his confidence in his disguise and deception capabilities. He felt superior to witnesses who couldn't provide accurate descriptions and to artists who created inaccurate composites. These investigative tools validated his skill at psychological camouflage. His psychological relationship with physical evidence was characterized by calculated risk assessment and countermeasure development. Rader understood what evidence was inevitable and what could be controlled. He developed techniques for minimizing useful forensic evidence while preserving trophies for his psychological satisfaction. The psychological pressure created by reward offerings and public appeals for information produced complex responses in Rader's behavior. Rather than increasing his caution, public attention often triggered his need to demonstrate that community involvement couldn't threaten his psychological superiority. Rewards became challenges rather than deterrents. His psychological response to false confessions and wrongful accusations revealed his proprietary feelings about his crimes. Rader felt that false confessions diminished his psychological achievements and wanted proper credit for his criminal sophistication. This possessiveness about his crimes would eventually contribute to his communication decisions. The psychological impact of investigative retirement and personnel changes on Rader was significant because it affected his psychological relationship with individual investigators. When respected investigators retired without solving his case, Rader felt validated in his superiority while also losing psychological opponents he had come to respect. His psychological analysis of investigation communication strategies revealed his understanding of law enforcement psychology and public relations concerns. Rader studied how investigators communicated with media and public, using this knowledge to time his own communications for maximum psychological impact and investigative disruption. The psychological satisfaction he derived from investigative resource consumption became a secondary source of pride in his criminal achievements. Rader felt that the enormous investigative effort devoted to his case proved his importance and psychological sophistication. Resource expenditure validated his criminal significance. His psychological response to technological advances in investigation was adaptive rather than purely defensive. Rader viewed new investigative technologies as intellectual challenges that tested his psychological superiority and adaptability. He took pride in staying ahead of technological detection capabilities through superior planning and execution. The psychological pressure created by generational changes in investigative personnel produced complex responses in Rader's behavior. New investigators brought fresh perspectives that challenged his psychological superiority while also lacking the institutional knowledge and respect he felt he had earned from previous investigators. His psychological relationship with investigative theories and hypotheses revealed his analytical approach to his own crimes and psychology. Rader would evaluate investigative theories about his motivations and methods, feeling satisfaction when theories were incorrect and compulsion to correct theories that misrepresented his psychological sophistication. The psychological impact of investigation publicity on his family and community created additional pressure that influenced his criminal behavior. Rader had to maintain his psychological compartmentalization while family and community members discussed the investigation around him. This proximity to investigation discussion fed his ego while requiring careful psychological control. His psychological preparation for potential capture involved detailed analysis of interrogation techniques and legal procedures. Rader studied how investigations progressed to arrest and prosecution, preparing psychological strategies for maintaining control even if captured. This preparation revealed his understanding that investigation psychology would eventually evolve to threaten his freedom. The capture and psychological breakdown of Dennis Rader represents one of the most significant moments in criminal psychology, the moment when decades of carefully maintained psychological control finally collapsed. His downfall wasn't the result of superior investigative work alone, but rather the psychological failure of his own control mechanisms when his ego override his survival instincts. His psychological state in the years leading up to capture was characterized by increasing need for recognition that gradually overcame his operational security discipline. The renewed media attention to BTK cases in the early 2000s created irresistible psychological pressure for Rader to reassert his relevance and demonstrate his continued superiority over investigators. The psychological trigger that initiated his downfall was his decision to resume communication with authorities after years of silence. This wasn't a rational decision based on operational considerations, it was an emotional decision driven by his psychological need for validation and control over his criminal legacy. His ego had become stronger than his survival instincts. His psychological relationship with technology became the specific weakness that enabled his capture. Rader's question about whether floppy disks could be traced revealed his fundamental misunderstanding of digital forensics. For someone who had spent decades staying ahead of investigative technology, this technological blind spot was psychologically devastating. The psychological impact of the floppy disk analysis that linked him to his crimes was the first crack in his psychological armor. When investigators traced the disk to his church computer, Rader experienced something he had never felt before: the psychological reality that his operational security had been compromised through his own mistake. His psychological state during the initial investigative focus on him was characterized by disbelief and denial. Rader had spent 30 years believing himself to be intellectually superior to law enforcement. The realization that they had identified him through his own technological error was psychologically incompatible with his grandiose self-perception. The psychological breakdown began when DNA evidence confirmed his identity. This wasn't just forensic evidence, it was psychological proof that his decades of careful control had been defeated by scientific analysis. The biological reality of DNA evidence was something his psychological defenses couldn't rationalize or deny. His psychological response to being placed under surveillance was a complex mixture of fear and fascination. Part of Rader was terrified by the loss of control, but another part was psychologically intrigued by finally being the subject of the investigative attention. He had studied for decades. He was experiencing investigation from the other side. The psychological impact of his daughter's DNA sample being used to identify him created additional emotional trauma. Rader's psychological compartmentalization had always protected his family from his criminal identity. Having his daughter and knowingly provide evidence that would destroy his life represented a catastrophic failure of his control mechanisms. His psychological state during the final weeks before arrest was characterized by increasing paranoia and loss of emotional control. Rader began exhibiting behavioral changes that family members noticed. The psychological pressure of knowing he was being investigated while maintaining his facade was overwhelming his previously perfect compartmentalization abilities. The psychological moment of his arrest was the complete collapse of his carefully constructed identity systems. When police identified themselves and placed him in custody, Rader experienced the psychological destruction of the invincibility that had sustained him for decades. The moment of arrest was psychological death of the BTK identity. His psychological response to interrogation revealed the sophisticated psychological defenses he had prepared for potential capture. Initially, Rader attempted to maintain control through denial and misdirection, but the overwhelming evidence quickly made these psychological defenses unsustainable, leading to a different strategy. The psychological shift from denial to confession represented a fundamental change in his psychological approach to his situation. Rather than continuing futile resistance, Rader's psychology adapted to find new sources of control and satisfaction within the context of his capture. If he couldn't avoid conviction, he would control the narrative. His psychological motivation for detailed confessions wasn't remorse or cooperation, it was his need to ensure accurate understanding of his psychological sophistication and criminal achievements. Rader wanted investigators and the public to fully appreciate the complexity of his psychological development and operational capabilities. The psychological satisfaction he derived from shocking investigators with details of his crimes revealed his continued need for psychological dominance even in custody. Rader could no longer control his freedom, but he could still control information and emotional responses. This became his new source of psychological power. His psychological relationship with his legal situation was characterized by acceptance rather than resistance. Rader understood that his technological mistake had created insurmountable evidence. Rather than waste energy on futile legal challenges, he focused on controlling his psychological legacy through his cooperation with authorities. The psychological impact of media coverage of his arrest was complex validation of his criminal significance. While capture represented failure, The extensive coverage proved that his psychological assessment of his importance had been accurate. The media attention satisfied his need for recognition even as it documented his downfall. His psychological response to family rejection and social disgrace revealed the limitations of his emotional detachment. While Rader could compartmentalize his crimes from his family relationships, he couldn't compartmentalize their rejection of him after his arrest. This represented genuine emotional trauma that penetrated his psychological defenses. The psychological breakdown of his compartmentalization systems was gradual but complete. As details of his crimes became public, the psychological barriers between his identities collapsed. Family, colleagues, and community members could no longer maintain their previous relationships with his public persona. His psychological adaptation to imprisonment required fundamental restructuring of his control mechanisms and satisfaction sources. Rader had to find new ways to experience psychological dominance and superiority within the severely constrained environment of prison life. This adaptation revealed the flexibility of his psychological systems. The psychological impact of victim impact statements created one of the few moments where Rader's emotional detachment was challenged. Hearing directly from survivors and victim families about the long-term trauma his crimes had caused created psychological discomfort that his usual rationalization mechanisms couldn't fully address. His psychological relationship with his own guilt and responsibility remained fundamentally unchanged even after capture. Rader continued to view his crimes as psychological experiments rather than moral failures. His intellectual understanding of their impact didn't translate into genuine emotional remorse or empathy for victims. The psychological significance of his sentencing to life imprisonment was the final confirmation that his criminal career was over. For someone whose entire adult identity had been built around his criminal activities, this represented psychological death even though he remained physically alive. His psychological adjustment to permanent incarceration revealed his ability to find satisfaction and control within severely limited circumstances. Rader began treating his interactions with researchers, writers, and media as opportunities to continue demonstrating his psychological sophistication and maintaining his criminal legacy. The psychological impact of aging in prison created new challenges for someone whose identity had been built around physical capability and operational control. As Rader's physical abilities declined, he had to find new sources of psychological satisfaction that didn't depend on his capacity for violence. His psychological relationship with his crimes evolved in captivity from operational memories to historical legacy management. Rader became focused on ensuring accurate documentation and understanding of his psychological development and criminal achievements for future study and analysis. The psychological breakdown of his marriage and family relationships represented the complete collapse of his civilian identity systems. With his public persona destroyed and his criminal identity incarcerated, Rader lost the psychological anchors that had provided stability throughout his criminal career. His psychological response to becoming a subject of academic study and criminal psychology research provided new sources of satisfaction and validation. Being studied by experts satisfied his need for recognition of his psychological sophistication while allowing him to maintain intellectual engagement with his criminal career. The psychological reality of spending his remaining years in prison created existential challenges that his previous psychological frameworks couldn't address. Rader had to develop new meaning systems and satisfaction sources that could sustain him through decades of incarceration without the possibility of renewed criminal activity. His psychological legacy became focused on his contribution to criminal psychology understanding rather than his operational achievements. Rader wanted to be remembered as someone whose case advanced knowledge about criminal development and behavior, rather than simply as another captured serial killer. Dennis Rader's psychological relationship with the legal system revealed his continued need for control and intellectual dominance even after his capture, rather than viewing the legal process as punishment or justice. Rader approached it as another arena where he could demonstrate his psychological sophistication and maintain his grandiose self-perception through strategic cooperation and narrative management. His psychological adaptation to being processed through the criminal justice system was characterized by analytical detachment and strategic thinking. Rader studied the legal procedures and personnel with the same methodical approach he had used for his crimes. He wanted to understand and exploit the system's psychology just as he had exploited his victim's psychology. The psychological significance of his decision to accept a plea agreement rather than go to trial was his recognition that cooperation offered better opportunities for controlling his narrative than adversarial proceedings would. Rader understood that detailed confessions would allow him to educate the legal system about his psychological complexity while avoiding unpredictable trial outcomes. His psychological relationship with his defense attorneys was complex because they represented his interests while he simultaneously wanted to ensure his crimes were fully understood and documented. Rader had to balance legal strategy with his psychological need for recognition of his criminal sophistication. This created tension between legal and psychological objectives. The psychological impact of formal charges being read against him was validation of the significance of his criminal career rather than shame or remorse. Each charge represented official recognition of his crime's impact and importance. The legal formality satisfied his need for acknowledgement of his criminal achievements by the justice system. His psychological response to psychiatric evaluation was characterized by cooperation motivated by his desire to be accurately understood rather than by genuine therapeutic engagement. Rader wanted mental health professionals to appreciate his psychological complexity and sophistication. He viewed evaluation as an opportunity for education rather than treatment. The psychological satisfaction he derived from detailed crime confessions during legal proceedings revealed his continued need for psychological dominance over his audience. Rader could control the emotional responses of lawyers, judges, and courtroom observers through his matter-of-fact descriptions of horrific acts. This became his new source of psychological power. His psychological relationship with the concept of justice was fundamentally different from normal understanding. Rader didn't view his prosecution as deserved punishment for moral wrongs. He viewed it as the natural consequence of his technological mistake. The legal process was an operational failure rather than moral reckoning. The psychological impact of victim impact statements during sentencing proceedings created one of the few situations where his emotional detachment was genuinely challenged. Hearing directly from survivors and victim families forced Rader to confront the human cost of his crimes in ways his psychological defenses couldn't completely neutralize. His psychological preparation for sentencing involved careful consideration of how to present himself to achieve maximum impact while maintaining his intellectual reputation. Rader wanted to appear cooperative and insightful rather than defiant or remorseless. This presentation was calculated to support his psychological legacy rather than seek leniency. The psychological significance of receiving multiple life sentences was confirmation that his criminal career had achieved the lasting impact he had always sought. Rather than viewing life imprisonment as punishment, Rader interpreted it as official recognition of the permanent significance of his crimes and their effect on society. His psychological relationship with court-appointed mental health professionals revealed his analytical approach to his own psychology and his desire to be accurately diagnosed and understood. Rader cooperated with psychological evaluation not for therapeutic benefit, but to ensure professional documentation of his mental state and motivations. The psychological impact of media coverage of his legal proceedings provided continued validation of his criminal significance and intellectual complexity. Rader felt that detailed coverage of his confessions and cooperation demonstrated to the public that he was more psychologically sophisticated than typical criminals. His psychological response to being questioned by prosecutors and investigators during legal proceedings was characterized by detailed cooperation, motivated by his need to ensure accurate understanding of his crimes. Rader wanted law enforcement to fully appreciate the planning and psychological sophistication involved in his operations. The psychological satisfaction he derived from educating legal professionals about his crimes and methodology revealed his continued teacher complex. Even in custody, Rader enjoyed explaining his psychological development and criminal evolution to lawyers and investigators who had spent years trying to understand his motivations. His psychological relationship with the concept of punishment was fundamentally altered by his lack of genuine remorse or empathy. Rader understood that society viewed imprisonment as justice, but he personally experienced it as the natural conclusion of his criminal career rather than deserved suffering for moral wrongs. The psychological impact of formal sentencing procedures was significant because they represented official closure to his criminal career and transition to his legacy management phase. Sentencing marked the end of his operational identity and the beginning of his focus on ensuring proper understanding and documentation of his achievements. His psychological adaptation to the appeals process revealed his strategic thinking about legal procedures and his understanding that exhausting legal remedies was expected behavior even when he had no realistic hope of overturning his convictions. The appeals were procedural rather than motivated by genuine hope for freedom. The psychological significance of his interactions with correctional staff during legal proceedings showed his continued need for psychological dominance and control within institutional settings. Rader studied correctional psychology and procedures with the same analytical approach he had applied to his criminal targets. His psychological relationship with legal precedent and the broader implications of his case revealed his grandiose thinking about his contribution to criminal justice understanding. Rader believed his case would influence future legal and psychological approaches to serial killer investigations and prosecutions. The psychological impact of being classified as a high-profile prisoner required adaptation of his control mechanisms to institutional restrictions and procedures. Rader had to find new ways to experience psychological satisfaction and dominance within the severely constrained environment of maximum security imprisonment. His psychological response to legal consultations and ongoing case management revealed his continued analytical approach to institutional systems and his desire to maintain intellectual engagement with complex procedures. Legal meetings provided opportunities for demonstrating his intelligence and sophistication to professional audiences. The psychological satisfaction he derived from being studied by legal scholars and criminal justice researchers provided new sources of validation for his intellectual complexity and criminal significance. Academic attention satisfied his need for recognition while allowing him to contribute to professional understanding of criminal psychology. His psychological relationship with victim rights advocates and restorative justice concepts revealed his fundamental inability to understand or engage with genuine empathy-based approaches to criminal justice. Rader could intellectually understand these concepts, but couldn't emotionally connect with their underlying humanitarian principles. The psychological impact of his case on legal procedures and investigative methods provided satisfaction through his contribution to criminal justice evolution. Rader felt that his case had advanced understanding of serial killer psychology and investigation techniques, which validated his assessment of his criminal significance. His psychological adaptation to permanent legal status as a convicted serial killer required integration of this identity into his self-concept and public presentation. Rader had to develop new ways of maintaining his psychological superiority and intellectual engagement within the context of his official criminal designation. The psychological significance of his ongoing legal correspondence and consultation requests revealed his continued need for intellectual engagement with legal and psychological professionals. These interactions allowed him to maintain his teacher role while providing opportunities for demonstrating his analytical capabilities and institutional knowledge. His psychological relationship with legal media and documentary participation showed his strategic approach to managing his public image and criminal legacy through controlled access to his story and perspective. Rader wanted to ensure accurate representation of his psychological complexity and criminal sophistication. The psychological impact of legal system evolution and changing approaches to serial killer cases provided ongoing intellectual stimulation and validation of his case's lasting significance. Rader felt that continued professional attention to his crimes proved their lasting importance to criminal justice understanding. His psychological preparation for spending his remaining years within the legal system's institutional framework required fundamental restructuring of his satisfaction sources and control mechanisms. Rader had to find meaning and purpose within the severely restricted context of permanent imprisonment while maintaining his intellectual engagement and psychological sophistication. The psychological legacy of Dennis Rader extends far beyond his individual crimes to encompass fundamental insights into criminal psychology, development, detection methods, and prevention strategies. His case represents a unique window into how sophisticated predatory psychology can develop and operate undetected within normal social structures for decades. His psychological development pattern provides crucial insights into early warning signs that might enable intervention before fantasy evolves into criminal behavior. The progression from childhood animal torture through adolescent violent fantasies to adult systematic murder represents a psychological trajectory that can be recognized and potentially interrupted through proper understanding. The psychological mechanisms that enabled his successful compartmentalization offer important lessons for understanding how criminals maintain double lives. Rader's ability to function as a model citizen while harboring murderous impulses demonstrates the sophistication of psychological defense systems that can develop and organize predatory personalities. His case revolutionized understanding of how environmental factors can enable, rather than prevent, criminal behavior. Rader's use of legitimate authority positions to access victims showed how institutional trust can be weaponized by sophisticated criminals who understand social psychology and human vulnerability patterns. The psychological insights gained from his communication patterns with law enforcement, advanced profiling techniques, and investigative psychology. Rader's letters and calls revealed the ego-driven motivations that can ultimately lead to a criminal's downfall when recognition needs override survival instincts. His technological downfall provides lasting lessons about how criminals adapt to advancing investigative capabilities while revealing the psychological blind spots that can emerge even in sophisticated criminal minds. The floppy disk error that led to his capture demonstrated how technological overconfidence can defeat decades of careful operational security. The psychological impact of his crimes on victims, families, and community members provided crucial data for understanding long-term trauma patterns and developing more effective victim services. The lasting psychological damage caused by his systematic approach to terror informed trauma treatment and community healing strategies. His case contributed significantly to understanding the psychology of serial killer communication and the investigative value of maintaining dialogue with active offenders. Law enforcement learned valuable lessons about managing criminal communications while gathering intelligence that could lead to identification and capture. The psychological profile developed through his case advanced understanding of organized serial killer psychology and the sophisticated planning capabilities that can develop in systematic predatory personalities. His methodical approach provided insights into how criminal sophistication evolves through practice and experience. His family psychology and the impact of his double life on spouse and children provided important insights into how criminal compartmentalization affects intimate relationships. The complete failure of family members to detect his criminal activities demonstrated the effectiveness of sophisticated psychological deception. The psychological analysis of his childhood development patterns contributed to understanding early intervention opportunities and the environmental factors that can either promote or prevent the development of predatory psychology. His case highlighted the importance of recognizing and addressing childhood violence toward animals. His case advanced understanding of how criminals exploit institutional trust and authority positions to access victims. The psychological insights into his use of church, scouting, and professional roles informed security protocols and background investigation procedures for positions involving vulnerable populations. The psychological factors that contributed to his 30-year evasion of detection provided valuable lessons for improving investigative techniques and interagency cooperation. His case demonstrated how criminal sophistication could exploit jurisdictional boundaries and communication limitations between law enforcement agencies. His psychological adaptation to imprisonment and continued cooperation with researchers provided ongoing insights into criminal psychology and the potential for extracting valuable information from incarcerated offenders. His willingness to discuss his psychological development advanced academic understanding of criminal evolution. The psychological impact of his case on law enforcement personnel provided lessons about managing long-term investigations and the psychological toll of pursuing sophisticated criminals. His case informed development of support systems for investigators working extended unsolved cases. His psychological legacy influenced development of new investigative technologies and forensic techniques designed to detect organized criminals who understand traditional detection methods. His case motivated advancement in digital forensics, behavioral analysis, and geographical profiling capabilities. The psychological insights gained from analyzing his victim selection criteria advanced understanding of vulnerability assessment and protective strategies for potential targets. His systematic approach to identifying and exploiting weakness informed security recommendations for individuals and families. His case contributed to understanding the psychology of criminal escalation and the pressure points that drive increasing sophistication and risk-taking in serial offenders. The analysis of his escalation patterns informed development of intervention strategies for managing known but uncaptured offenders. The psychological examination of his fantasy development and reality implementation provided crucial insights into the role of mental rehearsal in criminal preparation. His case advanced understanding of how violent fantasies evolve into operational plans and the intervention opportunities that exist during this development process. His psychological relationship with his crimes and complete lack of genuine remorse provided important data for understanding psychopathic personality development and the limitations of traditional rehabilitation approaches. His case informed development of specialized management strategies for psychopathic offenders. The psychological impact of media coverage on his behavior and decision-making provided lessons about managing public information during active investigations. His case demonstrated how media attention can both help and hinder investigative efforts depending on how information is presented and controlled. His psychological legacy includes lasting contributions to understanding the intersection of technology and criminal behavior. His case provided insights into how criminals adapt to technological advances while revealing the psychological factors that can lead to technological mistakes and overconfidence. The psychological analysis of his religious involvement and community leadership roles advanced understanding of how criminals exploit social institutions and community trust. His case informed development of safeguards and awareness training for religious and community organizations. His psychological development within family structures provided insights into how criminal personalities can develop within apparently normal domestic environments. His case contributed to understanding the limitations of family influence on preventing criminal development when underlying psychological factors are present. The psychological factors that contributed to his ultimate capture provided lasting lessons about criminal ego management and the psychological pressures that can lead to self-destructive decision-making. His case demonstrated how grandiosity and recognition needs can ultimately override survival instincts. His psychological cooperation with post-capture research and education efforts provided ongoing value for training law enforcement and mental health professionals. His willingness to discuss his psychological development created educational opportunities that continue to advance professional understanding. The psychological prevention strategies informed by his case include early intervention programs targeting childhood violence, improved screening for positions involving vulnerable populations, and enhanced training for recognizing sophisticated predatory behavior. His case provided concrete examples of warning signs and risk factors. His psychological legacy influenced development of victim advocacy programs and trauma-informed approaches to serving survivors of systematic violence. The long-term impact of his crimes on victims and families informed creation of specialized support services and healing programs. The psychological insights gained from his case continue to influence criminal justice education, law enforcement training, and mental health professional development. His case serves as a comprehensive example of sophisticated criminal psychology and the systematic approaches needed to detect and prevent similar crimes. His ultimate psychological legacy is the advancement of knowledge that can protect future potential victims through better understanding of how predatory psychology develops, operates, and can ultimately be detected and defeated through improved awareness, technology, and investigative techniques informed by comprehensive analysis of his psychological development and criminal career.